His mother stood beside the woman she had chosen. He walked straight past them both. It was the autumn of 1814, and the great ballroom at Marchmont House had been dressed for a single purpose that every soul in London society understood before the first carriage arrived. The Dowager Duchess of Marchmont meant to announce her son's betrothal that night. And she meant the announcement to be so public, so thoroughly witnessed, that no power on earth, least of all her son's own reluctance, could unmake it afterward. Julian Hawke, Duke of Marchmont, had learned of his mother's intentions only that morning, from a note left with his valet rather than spoken to his face, informing him that Lady Portia Renfield would be presented as his intended that evening, and that he was expected to receive the announcement with proper grace before 300 witnesses. He was 33, composed in the particular exhausted way of a man managing a crisis his mother did not know existed, and he had spent that whole autumn day not in outrage at being managed. He had long since stopped being surprised by his mother's methods, but in the library of a modest house in Bloomsbury, bent over a table of documents with a barrister's daughter he had met only 11 days before, trying to determine whether his family's name would survive the month at all. He came to the ball that night already knowing, with cold certainty, that he would not be marrying Lady Portia Renfield, whatever his mother had arranged with 300 witnesses standing by to see it confirmed. The Dowager Duchess made her announcement precisely as planned. At the height of the evening, calling the room to order with the particular commanding stillness only a duchess of 40 years' practice could command over a crowded ballroom, and presenting Lady Portia at her side with a hand laid proprietary on the young woman's arm. A handsome, wealthy, entirely blameless girl of 20, who had, Julian suspected, no more been consulted on the matter than he had. "It gives me the greatest joy," the Dowager announced, to a ballroom gone hushed and avid, to present the future Duchess of Marchmont. The room turned, as one body, toward Julian, waiting for him to cross the floor and claim the bride his mother had selected for him before the assembled nobility of England. Julian Hawke crossed the ballroom floor. He did not stop at his mother's side. He walked past the Dowager and past Lady Portia Renfield entirely, past 100 astonished, whispering faces, to the far side of the room, where a quiet woman in plain grey silk stood near a pillar, with no expectation of being noticed at all. And he bowed to her, and asked her, in a voice that carried the length of the ballroom, whether he intended it to or not, whether she would do him the honour of the next dance. "Miss Fairfax," Julian said, "will you dance?" The whole of London society, the narrator will tell you, held its breath in that instant with an intensity that would be repeated over 1,000 breakfast tables the following morning, for no one in that room, least of all the Dowager Duchess, whose face had gone the particular white of controlled fury, understood why the Duke of Marchmont had just walked past his own mother's chosen bride to ask an unremarkable barrister's daughter to dance, and Julian Hawke offered not one word of explanation to any of them. Louisa Fairfax gave him her hand without a flicker of the astonishment every other face in that ballroom wore, and if her own composure trembled at the enormity of what had just happened around her, she did not let it show. "You have just made a very great scene, Your Grace," she said, low, as the music began and the room turned to watch them, "over a partnership I understood to be a matter of documents and law, not dancing." "It was never only documents, Miss Fairfax," Julian said. "You will forgive me for choosing tonight, of all nights, to make that plain, but I find I could not stand beside my mother's chosen bride and pretend the last 11 days meant nothing at all, when they have meant, to me, a very great deal more than I expected them to. To understand what had driven a duke to such an open, reckless act, one must go back 11 days, to the morning the whole crisis first arrived at Marchmont House, in a plain, unmarked letter. It had come addressed to the Dowager Duchess directly, and she had not shown it to her son, for reasons that would only become clear a great deal later. A letter from a man calling himself Josiah Bell, proprietor of a modest but widely circulated scandal sheet, informing the Dowager that he held in his possession a set of naval dispatches, in the late Duke's own hand and bearing the Marchmont seal, proving that the 8th Duke of Marchmont had, in the desperate winter of 1798, sold intelligence of the Channel Fleet's movements to French agents for a sum of £11,000. A charge of treason that, if published, would not merely ruin the family's name, but would very likely see the current Duke's own inheritance and title stripped by Act of Parliament, treason being precisely the sort of stain the House of Lords did not forgive a dead man's son for carrying. The Dowager Duchess, terrified and unable to bring herself to believe her late husband capable of such a thing, yet equally unable to disprove it, had done what such women so often did in that era. She had decided the crisis could be managed quietly, through money, and had begun arranging a marriage to Lady Portia Renfield's considerable fortune with the private, unspoken intention of using the Renfield settlement to buy Josiah Bell's silence before the documents ever reached print, all without troubling her son with a word of it, believing, as she had believed since he was a boy, that a Marchmont man managed crisis best by never being told one existed until it was already solved. Julian had learned of the letter entirely by accident, having found it half burned in the library grate and pieced together enough of the charred remainder to understand the shape of the threat, and he had gone, in a state very near despair, not to a solicitor of the family's usual acquaintance. Men who might, he feared, be more loyal to the family's reputation than to the truth, but to a name he had heard mentioned once, in passing, by a fellow member of his club, a barrister in Bloomsbury named Fairfax, whose daughter, it was said, did the greater share of the man's legal reading for him on account of his failing eyesight, and possessed, by all accounts, a mind for documents and forgery that rivaled any man called to the bar in London. Louisa Fairfax had received the Duke of Marchmont in her father's modest study with considerably less awe than Julian had expected from a woman of her station, and considerably more sharpness. She was 25, plainly dressed, quick-eyed, entirely without the fluttering deference a duke generally received from persons outside his own rank, and she had listened to the whole of his frightened, half-formed account of the letter with her arms folded and her attention absolute. "Bring me the documents themselves, or copies of them, Your Grace, before you bring me any more speculation," she had said. "A charge of treason built on nothing but a blackmailer's letter is a charge I can dismantle from an armchair. A charge built on genuine documents is another matter entirely, and I will not waste either of our time guessing which it is." He had not, at that first meeting, been at all certain what he had found in her, only that it was a great deal more useful, and considerably more bracing, than anything his own family's careful management had produced in a week of private terror. It took 2 further visits, and 1 long night poring over copies Julian had managed to obtain through a bribed clerk at the scandal sheet's own printing house, before Louisa Fairfax set down her spectacles and told him, with the flat certainty of a woman who has found the flaw she was looking for, exactly why the documents were false. That long night stood out afterward, in Julian's memory, as the hour he stopped thinking of her as merely a useful mind and began, without quite deciding to, thinking of her as a woman he could not easily stop looking at. She worked by a single candle at her father's crowded desk, sleeves pushed back, ink on 2 fingers, entirely unconscious of how she looked doing it, and somewhere past midnight, when her eyes ached badly enough that she pressed the heels of her hands against them, and groaned in a manner no lady of his own set would ever have permitted herself in front of a duke, Julian found himself laughing. A real laugh, unguarded, the first he could remember in a fortnight of fright. "You find my suffering amusing, Your Grace," Louisa said, without opening her eyes. "I find it considerably more honest than anything I have heard from a drawing room in a decade," Julian said. "Every woman of my own acquaintance would have summoned a headache and retired an hour ago, rather than let a duke see her ink stained and groaning over a desk. You have not once, in 3 visits, troubled yourself to perform anything for my benefit at all." "I have not the leisure for performance, Your Grace, with your family's whole future currently balanced on a wax seal," Louisa said. But she was smiling now, faintly, eyes still closed. "Besides, I do not imagine a duke wants a performance from the one person currently standing between his name and the scaffold. I imagine he wants the truth, plainly delivered, however it looks doing the delivering. I find I want that more than I have wanted anything from anyone in a great while," Julian said, quieter than he intended, and something in his own voice startled him enough that he busied himself with the nearest stack of papers rather than examine what he had just admitted. Louisa opened her eyes at last and looked at him a long moment across the candlelight, and neither of them said anything further on the matter that night, though both of them, walking away from that desk in the small hours, carried the exchange with them a good deal further than either was yet willing to name. "The seal is wrong," she said. "Look here, Your Grace, the wax impression on every one of these copied dispatches carries your father's crest, correctly enough to fool a casual eye, but the die itself has a hairline crack running through the sinister quarter that no genuine Marchmont seal has ever carried. Because I have seen your father's actual signet, your own solicitor showed it me on my second visit, quite by chance, sitting in its case on your library shelf, and it is whole and uncracked. Whoever forged these dispatches worked from an engraving or an old wax impression, not the die itself, and reproduced a crack that exists only in whatever damaged copy they were working from. It is a small thing. It is also, I think, the thread that unravels the entire fabrication, if we can prove it before a body capable of judging forgery." Before the ball that would upend 300 witnesses evening, there was a fortnight of quiet, urgent work between a duke and a barrister's daughter, hunched over documents by candlelight in a modest Bloomsbury study, in which each discovered the other possessed exactly the resource the crisis required and neither alone could supply, and in which something considerably warmer than a legal partnership began, without either of them quite naming it, to take root. If a story of 2 people who could not solve a danger alone, and found they did not want to face anything alone again after, is the kind that keeps you listening, stay, what happened next very nearly cost them everything they had built. There came, on the 7th day of the fortnight, a moment neither of them had planned for, and both of them, afterward, remembered in precise and unbearable detail. They had been comparing a copied dispatch against a rubbing of the genuine seal by lamplight, heads bent close over the same small page, when Julian looked up and found Louisa's face a bare few inches from his own, her attention still fixed on the wax impression, entirely unaware of how near she had drawn or how long he had stopped breathing. He could see the fine ink smudge at her temple, where she had pushed back a loose curl without thinking. Could feel the warmth of her nearer hand resting flat on the desk beside his own, close enough that the smallest shift of either would have closed the whole of the distance between them. Neither of them moved. The candle guttered. Somewhere in the house a clock struck the half-hour, and still neither of them moved, and the air in that small crowded study went taut as a bowstring with the plain, unbearable fact of how very much either of them wanted to close that last half-inch, and how completely neither of them had any right to do it. She a barrister's daughter alone, with an unmarried duke past midnight. He a man who had come to her for evidence and found himself wanting, with a hunger that frightened him, considerably more than evidence. It was Louisa who broke it, drawing back with a small, unsteady breath, busying her hands with the papers, though her fingers were not quite steady doing it. "The seal, Your Grace," she said low. We were discussing the seal. We were, Julian agreed, and did not trust himself to say anything further for a long moment, and the two of them bent back to the documents with a carefulness that had nothing at all to do with wax or ink, and everything to do with two people who had just discovered, in one silent held breath, exactly how much they stood to lose if either of them let the moment finish what it had begun. It was 2 days after that unspoken evening that Josiah Bell made his second move, and it was a great deal bolder than the first. Having received no response from the Dowager beyond a request for a fortnight's grace to raise the sum he had named, and growing suspicious, correctly as it happened, that the family was quietly attempting to disprove rather than simply pay his price, Bell decided to force the matter by publishing a portion of the forged dispatches in his very next edition, calculating that a scandal half revealed would frighten the family into paying his full price rather than risk the rest emerging on his own timetable. Julian learned of the printer's schedule through his bribed clerk, with barely 2 days to spare. It was Louisa who moved fastest. She went herself, without waiting for the Duke's escort or his rank to smooth the way, directly to the cramped, ink-smelling printing house off Fleet Street, and found the proprietor, a nervous, ink-stained man named Gorse, already setting the type for the next morning's edition. "I am here on behalf of Mr. Fairfax, barrister, regarding a matter of forged documents you are about to print as fact," Louisa said, before Gorse could so much as rise from his stool, her voice pitched with a confidence she did not entirely feel and was determined not to let show. "You will halt the press tonight, sir, and allow me to examine those plates, or you will find yourself named as co-defendant in a suit for criminal libel alongside Mr. Bell when this forgery is exposed, and forgeries of this particular kind are exposed, sir, rather more often than the men who print them expect. I take my instruction from Mr. Bell, miss, not from any barrister's daughter who walks in off the street," Gorse said, though his hands, Louisa noted, had gone still on the type tray. "Then take this instruction from the daughter of a barrister who has, in 30 years at the bar, seen a great many printers hanged alongside the libellers who paid them, for want of the ordinary caution of checking what they were asked to set in type," Louisa said, and did not move from the doorway, and did not lower her eyes, though her heart was going hard enough that she could feel it in her own throat. "I am not asking for a favour, sir. I am offering you the chance to examine the evidence before you commit your own name to a forgery, which is rather more consideration than most men in your position are given before the assizes take an interest in their press." She set her father's own card on his desk, and beside it the rubbing of the true, uncracked seal she had brought expressly for the purpose. "2 days, sir, that is all I ask. Halt the edition 2 days, and if I am wrong, you may print whatever you please with my own apology attached." It was nerve alone, and the plain, unhesitating weight of a woman who did not flinch, that bought the 2 days. For Gorse, weighing a duke's coin against a barrister's daughter's calm certainty of a hanging, found his own nerve for the scheme considerably thinner than Bell's, and held the press, and it was those 2 days that gave Julian the time he needed to bring the matter before a magistrate of unimpeachable reputation, and lay the cracked seal evidence in front of him before a single false word reached. "Print." The magistrate, a careful man not easily moved by rank, agreed the discrepancy was serious enough to warrant a formal examination of the original seal die itself, still kept in the Marchmont library case, and it was Louisa who laid the true signet and the forged impression side by side on his desk with her own hands, and walked him through the comparison line by line, refusing to let the Duke's rank do any of the persuading that her own evidence could do more plainly, for she had learned, in a fortnight of frightened nights, that a magistrate weighing a duke's word alone might be tempted to find in a duke's favour, regardless of the facts, and she meant this conclusion to rest on nothing but the facts themselves. It was there, comparing the genuine, uncracked signet against the crude reproduction on Bell's documents under the magistrate's own glass, that the forgery was proven beyond any reasonable doubt, and a warrant was set in motion for Josiah Bell's arrest on charges of criminal libel and attempted extortion, to be executed the following week. That should have been the end of it. It was not, quite, for a cornered blackmailer with 2 days' warning of his own arrest is a dangerous thing, and Bell's final act, his second and most dangerous move, was to send word directly to the Dowager Duchess that same evening, informing her that unless the magistrate's warrant was quietly withdrawn, he would publish not the forged treason charge, which he now knew could not survive scrutiny, but a considerably more damaging truth he had also discovered in his investigations, that her son the Duke had spent a fortnight in close, unchaperoned company with an unmarried barrister's daughter, of no fortune and no connections, a scandal quite sufficient, printed with the right insinuation, to ruin Louisa Fairfax's reputation entirely and embarrass the Marchmont name besides, even with the treason charge exposed as false. It was this second threat, arriving the very morning of the ball, that had driven the Dowager Duchess to press forward with the Renfield announcement that same evening with redoubled urgency, reasoning, in her fright, that a swift and unimpeachable betrothal to an heiress of impeccable standing would drown out any whisper of scandal attached to her son's name before it could take root, whatever the cost to a young woman she had never troubled to meet or consider. Julian had learned of this second threat only an hour before the ball began, from Louisa herself, who had received a warning note from the same bribed clerk and come to Marchmont House in a hired carriage, breathless and furious, not for her own sake, but for what she rightly guessed the Dowager intended to do with the fright of it. "She means to marry you to Lady Portia tonight, to save your name at the cost of mine," Louisa said, standing in the Marchmont library in her plain grey gown, with her chin lifted against the whole weight of what was coming. "I do not ask you to prevent it, Your Grace. I have no claim on you that entitles me to ask anything of the sort. I have only come to tell you, before the world does it for me and less kindly, that whatever is said of me tomorrow in Bell's paper, I did what I did because I believed the truth was worth defending, and I will not apologize for a fortnight of honest work simply because it is about to be made to look like something else." "Stop," Julian said. "Lo, stop telling me you have no claim, Louisa, as though the last fortnight were nothing more than a legal engagement I might set aside as easily as a solicitor's retainer. You found the flaw that will save my family's name and very possibly my own neck, and you did it while defending a title and a fortune that will never once benefit you, out of nothing but a belief that a wrong should be righted, whether or not it profits you to right it. I do not intend to walk into that ballroom tonight and let my mother marry me to a fortune, while the woman who actually saved this family is left to be ruined in a scandal sheet for the crime of having been useful to me. I find I have rather stronger feelings on the matter than a solicitor's retainer generally inspires." It was this resolve, formed in the library in the hour before the ball, that carried Julian Hawke past his mother and Lady Portia Renfield, and across the whole width of a ballroom floor to ask a barrister's daughter to dance in front of 300 witnesses, not as a rescue, and not as a rebellion for its own sake, but as the only public act large enough to answer both threats at once. It told the assembled nobility of London, before Josiah Bell's paper ever reached a single breakfast table, exactly what the Duke of Marchmont thought of Miss Louisa Fairfax's character, and it left his own mother no ground whatsoever to complete an announcement he had just, wordlessly and unmistakably, refused. The Dowager Duchess did not accept the refusal quietly. She crossed the ballroom herself, before the dance had finished a single turn, her composure cracking at last in front of the very witnesses she had gathered to enforce it. "Julian, you will explain yourself this instant. or I will have Lady Portia's family believe you have taken leave of your senses in front of the whole of society. I will explain myself gladly, mother, though not in the manner you intend, Julian said, and stopped the dance, and turned to address not merely his mother, but the ballroom at large, for he had decided, standing there, that the truth deserved the same public stage the lie had been prepared for. Some of you will have heard, or will hear, by morning, that a scandal sheet intended to publish a charge of wartime treason against my late father. I can tell you now, before any of you read it in Bell's paper, that the charge is a forgery, proven so this very week, before a magistrate of unimpeachable character, by the woman standing beside me, Miss Louisa Fairfax, who found the flaw in the counterfeit seal that every one of my family's own solicitors missed entirely. My mother arranged this evening's announcement in fright, believing a hasty marriage to a fortune might drown a scandal before it could take root. I understand her fear. I do not share her solution. I will not marry a woman I have exchanged perhaps a dozen words with in my life, to purchase silence for a lie that has already been disproven, while the woman who disproved it is left standing at the edge of my own ballroom to be talked over as though she does not matter to this family's survival at all. She matters a very great deal. I intend, if she will have me, to make that plain to all of London, rather than leave it to a scandal sheet to decide the shape of the story for us. The ballroom, which had gone entirely silent for the whole of this speech, now erupted into a murmur that Julian recognized, with some relief, as considerably more scandalized delight than disapproval. For London society loves nothing so much as watching a carefully staged plan collapse into a better, truer story before its very eyes. And the tale of a duke's mother's scheme undone by a duke's own plain honesty was, the narrator can assure you, precisely the sort of story that Ballroom would repeat with relish for a decade after. Lady Portia Renfield, to her very great credit, was the first to laugh, a genuine, relieved laugh, for she had no more wished to marry a stranger chosen by his mother than Julian had wished to marry her, and she curtsied to the room with considerable good humour and declared herself delighted to have been spared a duty she had dreaded accepting, which did more to settle the room's opinion in Julian's favour than any speech of his own could have managed. The Dowager Duchess, standing alone now in the centre of the floor, with her carefully staged evening in ruins around her, looked at her son a long, cold moment, and then, to Julian's genuine surprise, something in her rigid composure gave way at last, not to fury but to something nearer exhaustion. "I only ever meant to protect you," she said, low, for his ears alone. "I have managed every crisis this family has faced since your father died, without once troubling you with the worry of it, because I believed that was my duty as your mother, and I did not think to ask whether you wished to be protected in that particular fashion, or whether you might have solved the whole thing better yourself, given the chance." She looked, briefly, at Louisa Fairfax, and something grudging and not entirely unkind crossed her face. "It appears you did, in any case, better than I did, and with rather less money." "You could have told me, mother," Julian said, gentler now. "That is the whole of what I would ask of you, going forward. Not that you cease caring for this family's welfare, but that you trust me enough to be told a crisis exists before it is already halfway managed without me. I am not the boy you once shielded from every hard truth. Mother, I have not been that boy for a very long time, and I find I would rather be trusted as a man than protected as a child, whatever the cost of the truth turns out to be." Josiah Bell was arrested the following week precisely as the magistrate's warrant had provided, and tried in the spring on charges of criminal libel and attempted extortion. The cracked seal die evidence laid before the court in full, he was convicted and transported, his scandal sheet folded within the month, for want of an editor willing to be associated with a convicted forger's enterprise. And the story London remembered of that whole affair was not the treason charge, proven false and swiftly forgotten, but the tale of the Duke who had walked past a fortune to choose the woman who had earned his trust with nothing but her own sharp mind and her own unhesitating courage. It was later that same ballroom evening, once the musicians had struck up again and the shocked murmur had settled into something nearer delighted gossip, that Julian found Louisa alone for a moment near the same pillar where he had first crossed the floor to find her, and finished, in private, what the candlelit study 7 nights before had left unfinished. "I believe," he said, "we left something unsettled over a rubbing of my father's seal some nights past." "I believe we did, Your Grace," Louisa said, and did not pretend not to know precisely what he meant. "I find I am done being careful about it," Julian said, and closed. At last, the small distance neither of them had permitted themselves in that candlelit study. And the kiss he gave her there, half hidden by the pillar and in full view of anyone who cared to look, was quiet and certain. And what it settled in both of them was not merely the fright of the evening, but the whole fortnight's held breath finally, gladly, let go. Julian Hawke and Louisa Fairfax were married the following winter. At a quiet ceremony her father conducted the readings for himself, despite his failing eyes, insisting he would not miss the one document in his career he most wanted to see signed correctly. The Dowager Duchess attended, and stood rather closer to the front than tradition strictly required, and was heard, more than once in the years after, to boast to other duchesses of her daughter-in-law's celebrated eye for forgery, as though the whole scheme to marry her son elsewhere had never once been her own idea, a small vanity Julian had decided, in the end, to let her keep, since a mother who has learned to boast of a daughter-in-law's cleverness has learned, by whatever crooked road, the one lesson he had actually wanted her to learn. Lady Portia Renfield spared a marriage she had never wanted, found within the year a match of her own, choosing with a younger son she had long quietly preferred, and sent Louisa, on the occasion of the Marchmont wedding, a wry note of congratulation, thanking her for having, quite without meaning to, done them both an enormous favour, by walking calmly into the middle of another woman's staged betrothal, and rearranging the whole evening's outcome for the better. By the second winter of their marriage, Julian had taken to bringing his wife every difficult letter that arrived at Marchmont House before he had so much as opened it himself, laying it on the desk between them the way she had once laid a rubbing of a forged seal. And the household came to understand, without either of them ever announcing it plainly, that whatever crisis found its way to that door from then on would be met by the two of them together, in the same crowded, candlelit, ink-stained partnership that had first proven, in a Bloomsbury study 7 years before either of them expected it, that some dangers were never meant to be faced alone. They kept the cracked seal die, once the property of a forger's careless copying, framed under glass in the Marchmont library beside the whole, uncracked original, 2 seals side by side, the true and the false, so that any guest who asked after the story might be shown, in a single glance, exactly how a hairline flaw, invisible to careless eyes, had once saved a family's name, and delivered, in the same stroke, the two people who found each other by first solving a danger neither could have solved alone.